I serve as the programs director for Trust Africa. You probably had in the morning some of the angles through which we come into the conversation. If I'm to take it off straight from where our moderator has teed it up, we came into the discussion to bring in the African perspective together with allies as part of the IFF consortium coordinated by my dear sister here under CODA, and then involving other actors, Pan-African Lawyers Union, Tax Justice Network Africa, AFRODAD, FEMNET, International Trade Union Council. We realized from the very beginning that the relevance of this conversation lied in it reflecting the specificities within which, as an African continent, we were affected by the problem. So when we interacted a discussion that centered the illegality part of it, we realized that there was actually a conceptual battle that needed to be fought. And at that conceptual level, our submission from the very beginning has been that when we are talking about illicit financial flows from Africa, we are not just talking about illegality, but we are talking about the unjustified, the unconscionable, the terrible ways in which wealth that is generated and created on the continent crosses our borders and ends up in other jurisdictions. We were supported in this endeavor by some of the very empirical research that was done by African researchers like your Ndikumanas, who, before the terminology of illicit financial flows had emerged, and the conversation at that point was about capital flight. And the argument was that there is capital flight from Africa because we don't have attractive investment opportunities. We didn't have stable enough environments. They ran very sound economic regressions that proved that there was no relationship between the flight, so-called flight of capital from the continent, and all these parameters. And that led to a conclusion that said if it wasn't about this, then there were illicit motives. So from how we have come into the conversation as the IFF consortium, as Trust Africa and our partners, is to say the discussion around illicit financial flows must really focus at all the ways in which wealth, assets that are generated from the continent mysteriously and in all the other ways that we know find themselves crossing our borders and ending in all these other jurisdictions. And when you go further, if you take the high-level panel report that has been talked about since this morning, we also then realize that whereas the report identifies three major sources of illicit financial flows from the continent and classifies them as one, the commercial aspect, secondly, the illegal aspect, and thirdly, the corrupt aspect. For the African continent, the most relevant source of illicit financial flows is the commercial aspect, is the tax-related aspect. It accounts for no less than 65% of the wealth that is being siphoned from the continent and ending up in other jurisdictions. They calculated that only about 5% of this phenomenon accounted to corruption. And in that case, corruption was defined as bribery of state officials and theft of public assets by state officials. It was only accounting to about 5%. And then about 30% was now accounting to illegal activities, right? So we cannot dismiss the importance of focusing on money laundering, focusing on financing for terrorism. But when we come to our continent, the most significant aspect of illicit financial flows is tax and commercial activity related. And you can unpack that even deeper. And when you go into that, you then realize that we have particularly vulnerable sectors from the continent, and the extractive sector is the biggest of them all. And we all know that we are always saying, as Africa, we can't be this rich in terms of natural resources and this poor in terms of the human development indicators and outcomes. But our wealth in natural resources is being compromised by the fact that our natural resources sector is the biggest source of illicit financial flows in the world. In fact, it accounts for around 70% of IFFs that are coming from Africa. And the important empirical studies that have already been done that show us that it's mostly your high value and lightweight minerals products that are most susceptible to illicit financial flows. So we're talking about gold, we are talking about diamonds, we are talking about now, because these studies were a few years back, we're talking about lithium, we're talking about cobalt. These are the mineral resources that can catapult us beyond even what we imagined in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. They are the most susceptible to illicit financial flows. And secondly, our financial services sector is the most susceptible to illicit financial flows. And I'll say that a little bit as I'm concluding, because it's a global question now, the question of reforming global finance or the global financial architecture. Thirdly, our telecommunication sector is the third most susceptible when it comes to illicit financial flows from the continent. So I think as we meet here under the auspices of ECOSOC, and we are galvanizing an African citizen's voice, it's important that the song that we sing, the dance that we dance, the narrative that we project really reflects these issues from our experience as African citizens and how it affects our countries and how it undermines our aspirations, our hopes for a more just global society, for a more just continent. So I want to come to the last point that I will speak to, and as I sit down, it's around the solutions that we are projecting. So of course we have said, let us win the narratives battle around this. The conversation built up with global North institutions that had millions of funds to support research. Right? It's very difficult to find a single African institution that can actually have $100,000 per year to invest in research. But they did this research from the Global North. We know that the Global North features into this equation mostly as a destination of illicit financial flows. We feature as a source of illicit financial flows. So it's a bigger problem for us. But secondly, part of why we are the most affected by illicit financial flows is just how the global financial architecture is currently defined and organized. We are currently living under rules that were negotiated at the end of the First World War, not even the Second World War, the First World War. When if there was a multinational corporation, it was just one company living one country in the global north and then operating in another country in the global south. But right now we are in a world where the nature of the multinational corporation has completely changed. It's now a hydra with 9 heads. If you chop off one head, by the time you're at the 4th head, the first head has come up already. Multinational corporations have these most sophisticated structures that take advantage of the current architecture to the extent that we will not even be able to know how to understand them and where to tax them. But the basics of the negotiation of international tax cooperation at the end of the First World War was focused on trying to avoid double taxation. And the agreements that emerged then said the countries, capital exporting countries from which these multinational corporations are resident or coming from will have a right to tax on what we can call return on investments. And the source countries where the economic activity is taking place will have a right to tax on profits. And because you have a multinational corporation that's operating in 7, 9, 10, and even more countries, they became very good at making sure that you will never know where they made money, where they made profits from. Because we don't have what's called country-by-country reporting. It's just consolidated reports that come up at the end of the day. So even if you look at the high-level panel reports that President Thabo Mbeki and the high-level panel produced, they cite companies that operated for more than 10 years without declaring a profit. Because you can play the rules to make sure that you keep operating, but you never declare profits in the country that you're operating. That's why this question of base erosion and profit shifting is important for the African continent. So we are at a place where we need to renegotiate international tax cooperation. And the processes that are happening at the UN level right now, as a result of the success of the efforts by Pan-African institutions and civil society on the continent that have really pushed to say we must reform global taxation rules, are extremely, extremely important. Because we now need to shift this equation so that multinational corporations can report on a country-by-country basis. Because they're making money in our countries, but they're declaring losses in our countries. So at the end of the day, we cannot tax them. So it really takes us to the point of the reforms to the global financial architecture that needs to happen right now. And Comrade Chair, if you allow me, someone talked about 0 seconds, I'll just close on that point. When you are talking about the reforms to the global financial architecture, I'm always urging colleagues, comrades, us as a generation, to take this matter as a matter of extreme importance right now. Right after the end of the Second World War, when we hear about the Bretton Woods institutions, the best Western country economists sat for 3 weeks uninterrupted. To us, a 2-day meeting is a stress. They sat for 3 weeks with no stop in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. And that's where they defined the architecture that defined global finance post the Second World War. And of course, it was defined in the interest of the victors. We have a new opportunity right now because of the all-encompassing global crisis that is confronting us to really speak an African voice into what is our interest in a new global financial architecture that will shape maybe the next 100 years and maybe even beyond the next 100 years. This is not a small matter. If we don't pay attention to it, it's going to be defined again by those who were responsible for the last era. There will be the same voices that will shape the next 100 years. So we really need to bring our voices as a coordinated Pan-African citizenry voice to say, as Africa, this is what we want to see. If our time had permitted, I was going to speak to some of the key components that I believe as the African continent must constitute the core ideas of that global financial architecture reform. But let me leave it at this point and just thank you for your attention.